our first lecture in a new series put on by the Center for the Study of Lived Religion at Foscari University, titled Illicit Objects, Lived Religion, Materiality, Performance, and Power. I'm Joseph Sanzo. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Lived Religion. And together, especially with Piera Tallin, whom I am very much thankful to, we've organized this new series really looking at and problematizing the notion of the illicit in the study of religion, in particular in the study of lived religion. So this inaugural lecture in the series will be given this afternoon by Henrique Fernandes Antunes, who is a research director at the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines and holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Sao Paulo. He has been a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley and a postdoctoral researcher in Paris, Ottawa, and Sao Paulo, where he currently is part of the Religion in the Contemporary World research group. His work examines the regulation and global circulation of ayahuasca, focusing on the legal, political, and cultural dimensions of its use. He's also written on the mainstreaming of psychedelics, religious exemptions in US drug policy, and the psychedelic renaissance. So tonight, or this afternoon, he will be giving a presentation entitled, Who Defines Religion? Ayahuasca and the Limits of State Tolerance. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. I prepared just a PowerPoint presentation. Is it possible to share the screen?
Yes, Piera, do you want to enable him as a co-host?
I should have allowed you to share now. Yeah? Right.
Yes. Can you see it?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Can you see
We can hear you fine, and we can see the presentation fine. So thank you.
Okay. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Talia. Thank you. Thank you, Piera. Thank you, Joseph, for I don't know what happened. Sorry. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in this inauguration of this lecture series. And just want to also highlight that besides being an ayahuasca scholar, a scholar of religion, I'm also a member of Santo Daime, a Brazilian ayahuasca religion, for 2 decades now. And as a researcher, I lived in the US, in France, and in Canada, and had to experience what it was like to live in different countries with different regimes of tolerance, with different drug policies, including the French case where ayahuasca is completely illegal. So I had the unique experience, I think not a lot of people share, of living in a country where your religion is illegal and that you can go to jail just for practicing your religion, and you feel scared to talk about it on the phone, through emails, chat messages, and things like that. So it was definitely a peculiar experience, considering that I come from Brazil, where the religious use of ayahuasca is regulated. But just before introducing the topic of the presentation, I just wanted to quickly highlight this. And so the main topic is who defines religion, and ayahuasca and the limits of state tolerance. But it's important to talk a little bit about ayahuasca before talking about the legal aspects, because I don't know how people, if they're familiar or not with the case of ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is an Amazonian brew. It's a tea made by two plants, a vine and the leaves of a small shrub, a small tree that's similar to the coffee tree. And it's found in various countries in South America in the Amazon region, like Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil. It was initially used by indigenous groups, so this is a little bit about the landscape of the use of ayahuasca. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of indigenous ethnic groups in the Amazon region that use ayahuasca for multiple purposes. It has also several names like Uni, Nishipan, Camarampi, Vegetal, Oasca, Ayahuasca, Capi. So it has, according to the different tradition, indigenous, religious, it goes by a different name. It may be also manufactured through different techniques, and sometimes there are even different varieties of plant species. There's also, not too much in Brazil, but especially in Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia, some practices that are called vegetalismo, which is more like a individual practitioners that have their clientele. They're not necessarily connected to any indigenous group. They're more closer to the urban centers, and they provide healing works, and they're more like in the a hybrid practice. They have some elements of indigenous shamanism, but also folk Catholicism, esotericism, and other practices. We have the Brazilian ayahuasca religions. There are particular developments from Brazil, groups that were founded between the 1930s and the 1960s. Three main ones, Santo Daime, Barquinha, and UDV in the Amazon region, and they have become recognized religions in the academic literature and by the Brazilian government in the 1980s, where ayahuasca was regulated initially in Brazil. And throughout the 1990s, early 2000s, we started seeing what the literature defined as new ayahuasca groups, new shamanic groups, groups that use ayahuasca in artistic performance, in psychotherapy, new age groups with meditation, hybrid practice like Umbanda and Santo Daime, Umbandaime, and all sorts of different practices that emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s in Brazilian urban centers and also in other countries in South America. And more recently, we have been witnessing a boom of what is called ayahuasca tourism. It's kind of more like the retreat centers that are spread now in South America, in countries like Peru, but even in Central America, in Costa Rica, there we're starting to see also some retreats pop up in Brazil as well. And this is more like a different scene with shamans, indigenous shamans that provide service to foreigners mainly, that charge maybe $3,000 to $5,000 for a week retreat where the indigenous shamans are going to perform ceremonies for, especially for the group that is coming. So it's a different modality as well, and it's kind of controversial as well. It raises a lot of issues about exploitation, appropriation, the sanitization of practices, the erasure of traditions to cater to this kind of upper class foreigner global north audience that comes seeking their personal healing stories. So this is also a new development, and also the therapeutic use of ayahuasca that some researchers are going on, have been going on for a while, especially in Brazil, since ayahuasca is not illegal and it's regulated, so it's easier to have research. And we have like the Brain Institute in the University of Rio Grande do Norte that studied, and the University of São Paulo that already conducted some preliminary research on the therapeutic use of ayahuasca. So it's a very broad universe, and there's a lot of expressions. We also see. Can you inform me when it's like 20, like 15 and 20 minutes in, so I just have an idea on how long I have? Okay, so we also have what the literature has called the world ayahuasca diaspora. For instance, Santo Daime, one of the Brazilian ayahuasca religions, is present in approximately 50 countries already. You can find it in Japan, Australia, all over Europe, in South America, Mexico, Canada, United States, you name it. And UDV is present in 10 countries, and they have now over 20,000 members worldwide, and they're highly structured organization, and also the growing presence of indigenous people in the international ayahuasca circuits that started to grow in Brazil in the early 2000s. Before that, the indigenous groups were more in their own territories, and from the 2000s on, they started inserting themselves in the urban ayahuasca circuits, promoting festivals, and kind of inserting themselves in this kind of Brazilian, but also in the international circuit. And now it's very common to see them. I got an Instagram from a friend of mine, and there's this indigenous person that I know from the Huniquin. He's currently doing kind of a tour in the US in promoting the Huniquin chants, doing workshops, presenting their culture, doing rapé ceremonies. Rapé snuff is a tobacco powder which is very used in the indigenous groups in relation with ayahuasca. The indigenous use of ayahuasca and tobacco, there's a long-lasting relationship there. So they, since tobacco is not illegal, they promote rapé ceremonies as well. So they are very inserted now in the ayahuasca circuit, and they also have been protagonists in the political activism. There's a very strong cultural and social movement going on in Brazil. They have held 5 indigenous ayahuasca conferences since 2017, and they keep getting bigger and bigger, and they're starting dialogues with indigenous groups from all over the world and international bodies and local governments, and kind of creating a political agenda that involves environment, territorial fight, cultural rights, and the rights for circulating with ayahuasca. So it's a very complex agenda that's been kind of fueled by the ayahuasca movement, and how it has become kind of a symbol of this new moment for indigenous people, especially in Brazil and in South America. And ayahuasca's cultural heritage, we've seen in Brazil, Peru, and Colombia cases. In Brazil, an ongoing recognition, and in Peru and Colombia, they're already recognized as part of also their cultural traditions. So this is a kind of a particular development for these 3 countries. But also there's the legal frame. Ayahuasca contains DMT, which is considered a Schedule 1 substance according to the UN Conventions on Psychoactive Substances, and which is and it's also considered a controlled substance in pretty much every drug legislation for any Western democracy, from Brazil to United States, France, and all over. However, there's a catch, because the majority of natural products that contains DMT are not subject to any form of control, because DMT is present in dozens, hundreds of plants. So it's impractical and almost impossible to make every plant that contains DMT illegal. So usually what is illegal is the extraction, the molecule, to synthesize it, to produce it, to extract it, but the plants are not themselves considered illegal in many countries. So this puts ayahuasca groups and ayahuasca itself in a legal gray area. Although the plants that are used in making it are not considered drugs or controlled substances, one of them contains a Schedule 1 substance. So that's kind of the reason of the legal problems that ayahuasca groups have faced, especially when ayahuasca leaves their geographical context of origin, and where there are different types of regulation, and it moves abroad. In the early 2000s, however, there's the a decision by the United Nations International Narcotics Control Board that stated that the plants themselves are not considered controlled substances according to the UN Convention. So they recognize that the DMT is a controlled substance, but they say that the natural use of these plants are not considered illegal, and that was used, for instance, that was a document that was issued due the request for the Santo Daime Church in the Netherlands because they were facing a lawsuit. So they asked the UN for an official position, the board, and they sent this letter, and that was also crucial for the legal recognition of Santo Daime in the Netherlands, which was later revoked like 17 years later. So it's complex, but according officially to the UN, the plants themselves are not considered illegal or controlled substances. And some challenges that we see for the Santo Daime and ayahuasca in a global context is that this global diaspora of ayahuasca has drawn attention of international media and government agencies. We often see sensationalist reports and articles portraying ayahuasca as this exotic and dangerous drug, sometimes like in France with accusations of brainwashing as dangerous cults, criminal organizations, the persecution of ayahuasca by drug agencies worldwide, the increase of raids, arrests, and legal cases, as we'll see. And just entering the Brazilian case, ayahuasca, the brew and the plants are not considered controlled substances. And although ayahuasca is not technically legal, but regulated for religious purposes. So sometimes people get that confused. They say, ayahuasca is legal in Brazil. That's not technically right. Because if like ayahuasca, like alcohol is legal. So any person over like 18 can buy alcohol in the supermarket, in a liquor store, but ayahuasca is regulated for religious purposes. It cannot be sold, you cannot advertise, you can't have proselytism. There's a set of regulations and guidelines for the religious use of ayahuasca. So that's important also to define. Ayahuasca was temporarily banned in 1985, and in by our version of the FDA, of the Ministry Health organ that classifies substances. But 6 months after the ban was temporarily suspended, and in a pioneering trailblazing initiative by the Drug Council, they started a working group to examine the matter. They created a group with researchers and members of the council. They did almost 2 years of field work, interviews. They did several visits to ayahuasca groups. I was in the southeast and in the Amazon region. Some of them even participated in ceremonies and drank ayahuasca. Members of this working group. So it's I always use this image. Can you imagine, like, the DA assessing something like that and sending agents, and the DA agents going to a ceremony and drinking ayahuasca and doing kind of this thorough report and reading the literature. So it was very innovative at the time, especially because it was done like 50 years ago, no, 40 years ago. It was done in like mid 80s. So it was a very innovative approach. Instead of just uh, uh, turning it illegal, they decided to study it. They read all the available literature, especially the anthropological, sociological literature. They did reports, they did visits, they drank ayahuasca, they consulted with the leaders of these groups. So 2 years after this process, they published a 35-page report that regulated the religious use of ayahuasca, that suspended uh, permanently the ban of the religious use of ayahuasca. But by then, we didn't have any guidelines. They just said, okay, this is not illegal. These groups can do the religious use of ayahuasca. And what it was interesting is the role of anthropology in this process, because by then there were no biomedical studies available. So they had to rely on anthropological data and see throughout the interviews and the historical studies and anthropological studies how these groups were. They used a lot about the Durkheimian kind of framework. Okay, these groups promote social integration, they promote stability, they're not promoting the kind of the enemy associated with drug abuse. They're groups that have very strong social ties, social connections, their communities. So throughout this kind, they're also associated that with also cultural traditions, from Amazonian shamanism to African Brazilian traditions, with folk Catholicism. So they did kind of all this to use Foucault's term, the genealogy of kind of these movements, creating the historical links between different traditions and creating this association of these groups as groups that had social values, social ties, that promoted community values. And through these culturalist arguments, and it's noteworthy that one of the final quotes is from Race and History from Levi-Strauss in the report, kind of as a manifesto for the religious diversity, cultural diversity, the acceptance. So through this culturalist argument, they regulated the use of ayahuasca in 1987. After an anonymous complaint in 1992, they revisited, but it was kind of super bogus. They said a lot of like misinformation that was like child abuse used with like LSD, cocaine, that they were kind of left-wing militia infiltrated. It was just kind of, those kind of fantasy tale things that anonymous complaints, you can find it in anonymous complaints. But they decided to reevaluate, and they reaffirmed, they consulted again with the groups, they did a second round of research. They consulted with anthropologists, historians, psychiatrists. They did interviews again, and they maintained. They said that the accusations were unfounded and that the groups had the right to continue to use ayahuasca. And in the mid 2000s, they founded another working group, this time with 6 representatives of ayahuasca religions in Brazil and 6 experts from different fields: psychology, psychiatry, anthropology, social service, um, psychology. I'm forgetting the last one, but it was 12 people, and they established the guidelines for what was established as the religious use of ayahuasca in Brazil, which is you cannot sell ayahuasca, you cannot promote miracle healings, ayahuasca is not therapy, you cannot do ayahuasca tourism in the sense that you cannot charge people to drink ayahuasca as a cultural or tourist activity. You should avoid proselytism. And also, they created guidelines to receive new members. They advised groups to do health screening. So it was kind of they set the parameters in a dialogue between scholars and the members of ayahuasca religions of this whole process. So it was overall a very innovative process that took decades to be developed, but now it's starting to create some problems, especially because of the indigenous use of ayahuasca, and it's widespread in Brazil, in the urban centers, because it was a regulation that was developed in dialogue with religious groups. And so there are some constraints, for instance, to circulate with ayahuasca, to ship, to receive. You need to be registered as a religious organization. Some indigenous group had their ayahuasca seized in airports. They were thrown away. They were could not board sometimes. So this is starting to create, and some indigenous groups already starting to register as religious organizations so they can circulate freely with ayahuasca, but at the same time they're very critical of the government stance because they feel that it's a colonial violence towards them to have to, since they're the originators of the use of ayahuasca. They're the ones that provided this brew to the other groups, and now they're having to present themselves, organize themselves, and legitimize themselves as a religion to get the right to circulate with ayahuasca. So there's this kind of ongoing controversy. And more recently, there was a public hearing in Acre to discuss the increasing seizures of ayahuasca by the police related to indigenous people. So it's very complex right now.
Henrique, it's 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna
I mean,
go
you
faster.
have more time clearly if you want, but yeah, more.
No, yes, I'm gonna
10
go.
minutes so that we can have space for the questions. Yeah.
Perfect. And in the US, there's ayahuasca is considered a controlled substance, but because of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, some groups won the legal right to use it in the country. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is a legislation from 1993 that decided that if the federal government creates a burden in the religious exercise, the sincere exercise of religion, then the government has to prove that the burden is not only a necessary action, it responds to a compelling interest, but is the least restrictive means to deal with that. So if you prove that the government burdened your religious practice, they have to prove that the measure was necessary and it was the least restrictive means to deal with you. Because UDV and Santo Daime successfully claimed that if they banned ayahuasca, they could not practice their religion because ayahuasca was central to their religion, and the criminalization then it would be a burden that could not be overturned. So the shift of the burden of proof landed in the government to prove that the ban was necessary, and they had three arguments: that it posed health risks and safety risks, that it could be diverted for recreational use, and that if they accepted the exemption for ayahuasca, other groups would demand new exemptions, then that could undermine their position in drug policies. And they lost in the three different arguments they proposed. The courts, all courts in the UDV case, the district court, the appeals courts, and the Supreme Court considered a balance of evidence because they all presented the experts saying, okay, ayahuasca is bad for health, it has a health risk. But the UDV presented its experts and said, we have research that say that with people that are consuming ayahuasca for 10 years, and he says that there are no health issues, psychological issues. So due to the balance of evidence and the fact that the government could not prove the arguments of diversion, risk, and drug policies, the courts decided that the UDV could use ayahuasca for religious purpose, and the government lost. 2 years later, the Santo Daime Church sued the government and also won on the district court. So after these two losses, the DA created an exemption process to allow other groups to apply for an exemption for the drug statute. But in almost 15 years, we had the first exemption granted just last year. They had over like 20 cases that were pending, some of them lasting like 7 years without answer, without timelines, and they request a bunch of documents. Some people even question the constitutionality of this process, saying that the Congress did not give the DEA the authority to define what is and what is not religion in the country and what is considered sincere exercise of religion. So they even question the constitutionality of this exemption process. There's the Sacred Plant Alliance that is considering suing the DEA because they think that this exemption process is illegal. And after that, there are also two non-Christian churches that also got the right to use ayahuasca through the same strategies of the Santo Daime and the UDV. and they got, instead of winning, they settle with the government, because now the strategy of the US government is, if they feel that they're gonna lose, they're starting to settle with the group, so they're not accumulating like losses over losses in the religious use of ayahuasca. There's also a recent DA report that's trying to assess that ayahuasca still poses a risk for public health and safety. This report was highly criticized by scholars. They say that it's missing evidence. They do not acknowledge the current research, the legal status of ayahuasca in other places. They're missing evidence. They conflate ayahuasca with LSD. So basically, the experts, I'm one of them, they say that it's more a political than a scientific report, and it's misleading. It conflates the risks while minimizing the health benefits and the positive cases. And shifting to Europe now. So in the US, it's kind of like a balance between rights and risks, you know. Can the government burden the religious use of these people? But if they do, they have to prove that the measure is necessary, because if they don't, they're gonna lose in the legal aspects of it. So they're accumulating losses because they cannot prove that ayahuasca is a health risk in the country. In Europe, it's kind of complex, but usually ayahuasca is not considered legal in any country. We have recently a decision in Spain that considers it not a controlled substance, but despite the decision, we have some countries like France and Italy that are very strict with ayahuasca, and I want to talk a little bit about France. I'm gonna skip. I think I have 5 minutes or so. 5 minutes. Okay. Uh, the Santo Daime group was already prosecuted twice in France because of the DMT and allegations of drug trafficking. I have a close friend, Claude Boucher. The first time he spent 3 weeks in jail. He left on bail, and he was convicted for drug trafficking of DMT in 2004, but there was a technical mistake in the trial, because what was illegal in France was the extraction of the DMT, the chemical process of extracting a molecule. So they got a report from this pharmacist that's claimed that ayahuasca was not an extraction, but it was a decoction. It was a tea, a brew. So it's not a chemical process of extracting a molecule when you make a tea. So this technique and the plants were not considered illegal in France. And with this 2-page report, they won the appeal. 3 months later, the French government banned ayahuasca. So ayahuasca was technically not illegal in France for 100 days. And I want to highlight the very particular case of the French reports on ayahuasca, the toxicological reports, and they created this notion of chemical submission and quote brainwashing. All of the toxicological, chemical, pharmacological reports on ayahuasca mention this notion of chemical submission. What is chemical submission? Technically, the French drug agency defined chemical submission if you give a a psychoactive substance to someone without their knowledge to commit a crime, either sexual assault or to steal or to do something. So if you give like GHB or an alcohol or a substance to someone without their knowledge to commit a crime, that's technically what is considered chemical submission. But these reports created a new definition of chemical submission. Is ayahuasca groups give ayahuasca to the people, they become suggestible, they become fragile, they lose their autonomy, they lose their individuality, and they're the targets of these dangerous cultish sectarian movements that empower themselves over these people to the point that they lose all their individuality, becomes literally like brainwashed. So they created a new definition of chemical submission from something that was kind of a legal term of giving a substance to someone without their knowledge, to kind of this cultish brainwashing definition. And without any proof, one of the reports even give 3 cases of alleged chemical submissions, and they're kind of hilarious, but kind of tragic as well. The first one says a woman was part of a Santo Daime group for several months and she lost 15 kilos. That's the first case of chemical submission. The second one is a journalist that was trying to infiltrate ayahuasca group to write an article on pseudo shamanism, and she had a really bad experience and had to had psychiatric follow-ups for 2 months. And the third case is a man that was in a bar having some drinks with this woman. He passed out and she stole, I think, his wallet, and they did a urine test and they found codeine, nicotine, cannabis, and other substance, and harmine, THC, cannabis THC, and harmine, which is one of the active ingredients of ayahuasca, but they didn't find DMT, and they said another case of ayahuasca chemical submission, question mark. So this highly kind of random and controversial and alleged cases to say that ayahuasca was kind of this dangerous drug for chemical submission. So it was banned because also of the interministerial mission for monitoring and combating cults, Miviludes. I don't know if you know about the work of Miviludes in France, but it's an organ, government branch to follow sects and cults and possible sectarian groups. So it's kind of a very particular development and something that would be highly controversial in countries like the US and Brazil, to have a government branch that monitors groups and to see if there are cults or not. And they were part of the drug council report that banned on ayahuasca. I interviewed a member of the council that was part of this meeting, and he didn't want to be I add the pseudonym to him in my book, but he said that the Miviludes representative acted as rapporteur and the rapporteur and the meeting, and he said, "Oh, we have this new dangerous cult here in France called Santo Daime, and you have to ban it immediately. This is a very dangerous group, and they're not only a public health risk but a public order risk as well." And this guy that I interviewed, he said, "Okay, but we're pharmacologists, we're pharmaceuticals, we're chemists. This is a commission of the Ministry of Health. We're not equipped. It's not our job to say if these groups are cults, if they're religions, if they're sects, or whatever. We're here to say if ayahuasca poses a risk in terms of its chemical structure, if it poses a risk in terms of toxicology. And we're not here to define if these groups are religions or not." But he lost. He was the only one that voted against the prohibition. 15 voted to ban ayahuasca and 5 abstentions. So ayahuasca was banned 3 months after the Santo Daime won the appeal. In 2019, my friend was arrested again, and he was convicted into 2024, but with probation, 18 months probation. He tried to appeal to the Council of State because in France they have a new definition now of drug, because after it was tautological. Drug is whatever is in the list of controlled substances. So it was okay. Whatever is in the list is a drug, and a drug is everything that is in the list. And now it's the definition of drug, of narcotic, is something that is toxic and addictive. So these 2 characteristics now for narcotics. So they shifted their argument from the religious freedom to the chemical and technicalities. They started to they inserted in their appeal a lot of reports saying that ayahuasca it's non-toxic, it's non-addictive. They showed the latest research, psychiatrical, chemical research. They presented pretty much all the data available, most recent data on the health safety profile of ayahuasca. But the French government, the Council of State, denied their request to declassify ayahuasca, alleging that the old reports that ayahuasca was a health risk. And I must say that one expert evaluated one of these reports, and she found out that was based on false information, plagiarism, and other false allegations. One of the reports that's more cited by French authorities was based on plagiarism and false information. So it's a very delicate process. And basically, my friend in France, Claude, has two options that the French government said to him: either you quit ayahuasca or you quit France. Those are your two options. So now he's impeded to exercise his religious practice in France. And so my book was an attempt to kind of look to these different cases, different outcomes, and see how different governments dispute the meanings of ayahuasca, how they classify the limits of state intervention, religious freedom, how the discourse of human rights and rights become something like a double-edged sword, is used not only for groups to claim their freedom, but also for governments to curtail their practices as well, and trying to kind of observe the paradoxes between religious freedom and state intervention. It's hard to sum up 15 years of work, 200 pages of research in 30 minutes, but I think with the Q&A we can explore more deeply these topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrique. Thank you very much.
I talked a lot, sorry.
No. Thank you very much, Enrique. This is fantastic. So we have some time for questions. So if anybody would like to raise a question, please just raise your hand in the chat.
Maybe Enrique, you can stop to share your screen, and so we will move everybody to the
Great. So if there aren't any questions at first, I'd like to ask a question. So one of the issues that we're kind of thinking about in terms of this lecture series is how people react, engage, etc., to shifting notions of the illicit. And so, Enrique, I'd like to ask you personally, since you raised kind of your personal experience, how you personally react to shifting notions of legality, illegality, etc., of ayahuasca as you move to different spaces. How do you negotiate those different legal parameters in light of your religious practice?
As you said, like lived religion, it all depended on where I landed. For instance, my first international experience with ayahuasca was in California, and the group it's now an extinct group. A group, I'm not gonna name the names because they weren't legal at the time. They were kind of a underground group. Uh, but everything was super light, I got there on a Tuesday. On a Friday, I was already participating in my first Santo Daime ceremony because I was Brazilian and Santo Daime comes from Brazil. They all embraced me. And it was kind of a very light mood, every now and but, text messaging, talking about works, WhatsApp groups, email chains. It was very a free environment. Every now and then people would say, okay, if you run into law enforcement, this is what you should say. Okay, this is a private event. This is a family event. This is a friends. We're just doing a celebration here. Kind of teaching us how to approach, authorities, but very something very sparse, and never encounter any issue. I was there for 1 year, So for me, the first experience was super good. But when I came to France, it was a completely different thing, because it was completely illegal. And it was hard to even find people connected to Santo Daime. I had to reach out to some friends. And after meeting Claude, the first like strange thing was talking about Santo Daime over text messages, and he said, "Okay, no, don't mention Santo Daime. Use kind of like codes, we use codes like choir or meeting or meditation or things like that." So that was kind of like the first alarm sign, the first time, okay, this is different here, he's really afraid of being surveilled. And for instance, ayahuasca, it's always in an altar in a high place, and in his place, he had to heat it, hide it, and so it was very. And I felt like how the illegality pushes you to the underground. You start feeling, okay, am I being surveilled? Who is watching me? Is somebody, you feel afraid of sharing, and of people knowing that you're part of this, and what the implications. So you really kind of enter the mindset of a kind of a criminal organization, because you're pushed to clandestinity. You're forced to use code language to avoid certain practices and behave like somebody that it's kind of dodging law and police forces. So it's a very strange experiences, and that influences a lot the experience that I had. And even my will to drink, kind of diminished because of this environment, this oppressive environment.
Thank you for that response. Other questions, comments, etc.? Yes, Christina?
I have several questions, but they are very much related to each other. So first of all, do we know anything about the details of the rituals within this, and how do people within this religion define the kind of belief they have, since this is present across several countries? Do they adopt anything from the religious practice or the ritual practices of these different countries? So how do people define themselves to make this a bit more legitimate, or to legitimize these kinds of practices? So yeah, I have several
Yeah,
questions
yes.
regarding this.
As any religious movement, once it expands and especially moves abroad, it kind of incorporates some different, characteristics from the culture, the new landscape. And we have, for instance, new influences, and especially, for instance, when it moves to Canada, US, and it starts to kind of have maybe a more open, more progressive stance. For instance, some practice are still, although are ingrained in some sort of like patriarchal and machismo, so some values of these religious groups tend to be questioned. Some practices are changed. For instance, in Santo Daime, in Brazil, only the men serve the drink for men and women. But in Canada, the church, the leader now serves, and she leads the ceremonies. So she created, so that's the practices tend to adapt to the new audiences, and that creates tensions as well with these traditions, on kind of more orthodox people and people that are more kind of, ah, let's say old school, and want to keep things as they were 20, 30 years ago. So we see also some tensions on legitimacy, authenticity, and things like that, which I think it's normal when groups travel abroad. So the rituals themselves, they vary a lot from group to group. But one thing that is very common throughout ayahuasca, it's kind of its versatility, its culture, its religion, it's a medicine, it's used, in religious rituals, but people talk about healing all the time. So it's a substance that resists classification and these well-defined boxes that Western kind of Latour defines, like science, therapy, medicine, culture, religion, spirituality. So it touches a little bit of all these boxes in every tradition, and that's it's why it's hard to define, and it creates all these noises, because and the governments are compelled to say, okay, you do healing works, but you're not therapy. You can't say you heal people. So you have to create kind of this deals, these regulations that accommodate these practices that resist these well-defined Western categories as well. So I see as a double process. First, the resist of this urge to classify ayahuasca as religion, as it is a little bit of everything. And also, as it travels abroad, it tends to kind of adapt the characteristics of this new environment and create some clashes with the groups in their countries of origin, which they attempt to adapt, negotiate. So it depends on group to group.
Thank you very much. I have also a question, if I can enter. It is a reflection due to the fact that ayahuasca is so multiple, at the same time that in this lecture series we are reflecting on the notion of the illicit. Thanks to your presentation, and your book that is so rich and such profound materials. I think through these three, at least, different legal frameworks, I have the sense that the illicit clearly appears as something that is contextual, that is situated. So it is not something that is a unique and a mono something. Is not an issue that is complete and unique, but it is something that is constantly shaped. But at the same time, through what you are saying now, I realize that also, for example, regulations not only shape what is illicit and what is not illicit, but they also fragment the illicit. Like if we imagine as ayahuasca as something illicit as a drug, ayahuasca is one of the aspects, right? Ayahuasca is a drug, and so it becomes completely illicit. But then regulations fragment it, and for example, in Brazil, and show that there is the possibility of using it ritually, but not using it as a medicine, as biomedicine intended. So from a therapeutic point of view. So there is different regulations fragment what we understand as illicit. And also that I think that your book is a fantastic example of this complex entanglements, this complex relation between how the illicit is related to, so let's say, the illicit shape and is related also to what is religion or not. And yes. So there is a double, or let's say multiple process on what is the thing that defines the other.
Yes, I think that's one of my main goals of my work, is see how these different categories are framed in relationship to each other. They don't exist in a vacuum. They are always creating in opposition to each other. And what I think it's interesting is that what I try to show is that the state is shaped in this process as well, because it's what we understand as they define what is religion, what is medicine, what is therapy, what is drug, It's through defining these boundaries that the boundaries of the state becomes clearer, where their limits, where they trace, what is acceptable as legitimate and what is criminalized as a dangerous practice. So I think in trying to show up this processes, I was trying to show how the state creates its boundaries as well, its frontiers, and how it creates, how its tentacles spread through these processes, through defining their categories, instead of creating the state as this monolithical, entity that just, operates from top down. No, it's through the experts, through the trials, through the regulations process, through the categories, through the experts, through defining, this is commerce, this is therapy, this is not religion, this is a way of life, this is a philosophy, this is culture. Through these disputes over these categories that we see the state taking shape. That was kind of my, and the illicit is also a major part of it. The illicit plays an essential role in the definition of the state, the power to define exemptions, what can consider to be legitimate, and the power to create even exemptions, like the US case. Okay, this is illegal, but I'm gonna grant you this exemption for this particular case because you have to conform to this framework as religion, and that creates constraints as well. I always say that regulation is a double-edged sword. It grants legitimacy, it grants the legality, people come out of the shadows, they have the freedom, but at the same time they have to constrain to bureaucratical norms. Sometimes they have to give up certain practices, they have to incorporate biomedical frameworks, medical screenings, surveillance protocols. The DEA has the right to know how many liters you're consuming, importing, giving. You have to control everything. So it's a give and take. It's not a panacea, it's not a cure for all evils, but I try to argue that although it's kind of this give and take, is not this medicine, and sometimes there imbalances, power relationships that kind of create some problems for minority groups. But the worst kind of policy is prohibition. And without a doubt, that's what I saw in France when you're forced to give up, to go to the underground, to become clandestine. Is the worst type of policy. It doesn't allow accountability. If someone is committing an abuse, who are you going to turn into? Us? You're going to say, I'm a part of this criminal organization and I've been abused. So you can go to jail just to say that you're part of this practice that considered illegal. So the criminalization is the worst kind of policy possible, and regulation has its tensions and negotiations.
Well, thank you very much, Henrique. I think we are finished for this session, but we just want to thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and conversation. And for those who are here, our next presentation in the series will take place on January 28th by Giovanni Caponi, and the information is in the chat. So thank you again, Henrique, for a wonderful presentation and a great inaugural lecture within this series. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I put my mail in the chat if anyone wants to get in touch, get to know a little bit more about my work. Please feel free to reach out. Thank you again for the invitation. Have a wonderful weekend. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Henrique. Muito obrigada. Thank you very much for
Eu que agradeço. Thank you so much.